Welcome to Techiecast Jacks, where the top technology and business experts around discuss the latest trends in high tech. This podcast is hosted by Joe Holbrook, who's an experienced technologist pundit in Jacksonville, Florida.
Welcome to Techiecast. I'm Joe Holbrook. I'll be your host today. I'll be talking about the Google Cloud Engineer Certification Exam. With that said, let's get into the top 10 areas that we want to focus on for the Cloud Engineer exam. Now, there'll be a link down in the description as well to review the blog post that is out there as well that I posted on this, so you could dive into additional links that are in that blog post. With that said, let's go ahead and talk about the top 10 things that you really should know before taking this very challenging exam. Number 1, know your G-Cloud commands for managing and creating projects. For example, know G-Cloud projects list. Know how to create a project. Also, too, when it comes to G-Cloud, we need to know, for example, how to spin up a Google Kubernetes engine cluster and also expand it as well. For example, if we want to develop a application and we want to deploy that on Google Kubernetes engine, what we want to do is, of course, to spin up a cluster first, and then we would be able to deploy our application services after we, of course, deploy our nodes and our basically pods and other container parts and pieces, essentially, that we're going to deploy as part of our application deployment. Now, we do need to know the kubectl commands, for example, how to list pods, how to list services and nodes as well. For example, kubectl get pods is an example. And again, if you go to the blog post, there'll be much more detail. And I have a deep dive on a lot of the syntaxes. So just be aware, there's a lot more online around this. Now, when it comes to the second item, and again, it really falls into Kube and Kubernetes Engine GKE, we need to really know, again, how to create that cluster. What is the command in G-Cloud? So, for example, G-Cloud container create, and then what is the name of the cluster, and then how many nodes and other information, where we're going to deploy it, like the region and zone. And again, I encourage you to go online and review a lot of my posts on this because, again, on the exam, you're going to look at quite a bit around that area. The next thing I want to point out is going to be around the use cases and differences between container registry, container builder, and cloud source repositories. So with that said, we need to be aware that container registry is going to be a service in Google Cloud we're going to use to secure our containers, to provide version control, to also provide versioning and not just versioning, but also, I should say, for example, to be able to scan those containers before they're deployed to production, for example. When it comes to cloud build, this is what's going to really put together our CI pipeline, for example, to take basically from cloud source repositories our working copies and get ready to generate them to be placed out into production eventually. So that's going to be our build service. Now, when it comes to the fourth item, we really need to know, for example, Cloud SQL versus Cloud Spanner. For example, if we want to deploy a SQL database, then we have two main choices in Google Cloud. The first is Cloud SQL and the second is Cloud Spanner. We need to know the use case between SQL and Spanner. For example, SQL will scale horizontally, and Spanner will scale basically horizontally as well. And let me rephrase that. I think I said that backwards. Basically, Cloud SQL will scale horizontally, meaning that we're going to add basically more nodes, more power to our nodes, basically essentially larger nodes. That's vertical scaling. And then when we add more nodes, scaling them out, basically that's horizontal. And Cloud Spanner is really going to be that horizontal split there. Now, when it comes to knowing our use cases for data services like cloud storage, App Engine, based data services. So for example, with App Engine, we may want to use, for example, Cloud Data Flow or Cloud Data Store. We need to know the differences between them. Also know too, when it comes to deploying Windows on a compute engine, we want to know, for example, first of all, that if we're deploying Windows on compute engine, we want to, of course, automate our authentication processes. We may want to tie in some kind of directory services as well. We could use, of course, Cloud Identity or G Suite as part of an organization. That's our call. Also, too, OS login. So, for example, if I'm going to deploy Linux boxes on Google Cloud, the best practice that Google recommends is to use OS login. And we, of course, need to go over to the enterprise best practices for Google and review those notes, because on the exam, strangely enough, a lot of the content, I think, came directly from that one web page. So reading that is well worth your time. When it comes to the seventh main area to focus on is going to be around IAM permissions. Now, this is, of course, not exactly a simple area. There's a lot here to cover. But to sum it up, basically, we need to know, for example, the three types of essentially the way that we would allocate basically permissions. So we know, for example, that there's legacy-based permissions, and then we know, like, for example, when it comes to roles, we have also, for example, custom prefabbed roles as well. So we need to know, for example, how do we actually go out and deploy basically a templated based role, a custom role, or do we go out and just use a non-granular, basically legacy-based role? Now, when it comes to understanding permissions, one of the things to point out too, I think, is that when it comes to auditors, it seems like almost every Google exam likes to talk about auditors. So we need to know, how do we handle auditors when they want to, for example, audit our environment? Do we give them basically full project access, or do we only grant them access to the specific modules that they need? Do we allow them view access and read access, or do we only allow them view? Again, pretty straightforward. And Google, of course, has a best practice around auditors. You need to go and review on the Enterprise Best Practices page. There's a link to that there. Now, number 8, this catches people by surprise, I think, and it's around Stackdriver. Now, Stackdriver, at the date of writing this, is actually going to be called Operations, but I wanted to point that out because the objectives, the exam guide, basically states Stackdriver still, but that is being, of course, changed out for whatever reason around Stackdriver going to Operations. I think it's more of a marketing plan than anything. It doesn't, there's really no significant changes to it other than, again, they did integrate it into Google Cloud fully pretty much. So I think that's a good thing. They are still supporting AWS monitoring. I don't know how long that's going to last, but who knows? With that said, so what do we need to know about Stackdriver? We need to know how to set up logging. Now, logging, we need to realize that when it comes to logging, we want to log for many different reasons. One is to identify, again, activity, to review that activity, to see what people are doing. Another thing is to keep it for audits. Now, Stackdriver by default will maintain certain types of logs for up to 400 days. Now, I know that has changed initially over the last 2 years. For example, again, it's all about the subscription that you had as well. But now that it's fully integrated, that subscription has basically gone to more of a consumption-based approach. And with that said, we need to know how to set up alerts and understand the differences between debug and trace. And basically, for example, do we use debug to understand latency, or should we use trace to get latency details? Do we need a baseline or do we not? These are things that we want to cover, of course, in the deeper modules around the Cloud Engineer exam. Okay, what about number 9, BigQuery pricing? This is one of the things that I think caught me at the time. I don't do a lot with BigQuery, but there is a question that I ran into around BigQuery pricing. You want to know the difference between on-demand versus flat rate, and what is additional. Storage is additional. Go to the pricing calculator for Google and review the subscription pricing for App Engine, BigQuery, Compute Engine, for example. You'll likely get a question, of course, around the calculator that is clearly defined as well. Pretty much, I think it's like in the first objective on the Cloud Engineer exam, first section, that is. So just get to know the pricing calculator and understand the pricing of the major services. Now, the last thing I want to cover for the Cloud Engineer exam is going to be how to save billing information. So if we want to save billing information and we want to query against it, we want to save it to BigQuery. And BigQuery will allow us to go in and review those data sets and basically try to derive value from it in any way that we need to understand the behavior of our cloud spending, for example. Now, we could also save the information in JSON, for example, as well. Now, when it comes to taking this exam, again, you want to study hard, of course, routinely as well. I would highly recommend you go to the exam objectives. The link will be in the description, depending on the platform that you're on. Listening to this, that is. And with that said, go to the Google Cloud Engineer exam guide and review basically the objectives that are listed and make sure that you understand pretty much what each one is asking. That's the best way to ensure that you have enough knowledge to pass the exam. Another thing, too, is when it comes to reviewing GCP documentation, you have to go to the Google Cloud Enterprise Best Practices webpage. And it's more than just a webpage. It's pretty extensive as far as what it covers. So you'll go to the webpage and you'll review on the right side. There's different sections. Review all the sections. You're going to likely see at least 3 or 4 of those sections tested, and they're directly from the objectives. So if that makes any sense, they're pretty much giving you ahead of time what they're going to test you on. You just have to review the web page, basically. With that said, lastly, I think you should also review Code Labs, Quick Labs, and also sign up for a free account if you do not already have one. You really should practice a lot of these syntaxes for the commands that you'll be tested on. Now, for those interested, I do have a command list as well on several of my websites, and also I think it's linked on some of my Medium blogs as well. With that said, I wish everybody much luck on the exam. If you have any comments or questions, please do reach out. Good luck and happy testing.